We'll just keep it very casual, very informal. There are handouts at the back table if you, looks like everybody's got them. And there's so much to share about SACS, it's going to be hard to really delve deep into any specific area, so this is really just a broad overview. First in our 101 series, which is meant to be introductory type information on a variety of subjects. SACS is such an important one, and so often I hear SACS misquoted. Well, SACS says we have to do this. No, they really don't. Or we don't fully understand what the SACS requirements are. So hopefully we can improve on our knowledge and continue to build on what we learned today. So I'd be curious, just as we start, what were a couple of somebody's brave specific questions you hoped we would cover today, according to SACS? Or did anybody have any specific, oh, I hope they talk about fill in the blank part.
I guess I was curious about what's going on with the system SACS.
More at a local level.
Yeah, are we probation?
Sure.
Are we almost on probation? Are we,
what's going to happen to us?
Yes.
We'll definitely get to that piece of it, but help me remember. But there's a piece when I'll talk about outcomes for SACS, and I'll share where we are. It's all pretty good. So not too much to worry about. Okay.
From my perspective, I understand we're making 12, 13 good, okay?
On the IE stuff?
Yeah, I just
Okay.
want to make sure I've got it right for 13, 14.
Yeah, me too, and it's all over the board. Seems like we're still getting, depending on who you ask, what the directions are. So we're still trying to get that, but we'll try to address some of that for you today.
It's never going to be cut and dry, but I just feel like at least not at the beginning,
Yeah.
not in the middle of it.
Exactly. Anybody else? All right, very good. Well, in my role as VP, it's been a little bit different here than at my prior institution. I'm not quite as connected with all the SACS stuff as I am here, or as I was at NCTC. And I know Kathy probably didn't remember this, but I remember in our interview with the deans and department chairs, my interview, and I asked about the QEP, and Kathy's response was, oh, system office is working on that. And I tried to hide my shock and awe. I was like, really? They have a system office for that? But I wanted to share some of the reasons why I feel qualified to talk about SACS at a basic level. At my other institution, we were on the same reaffirmation timeline. So NCTC was in the same processes as Lone Star, going through it all about the same time. Lone Star started a little later than they probably should have. So I wrote about 75% of the compliance report for NCTC, authored it, did the supporting documentation, did the research, gathered the data, led the committees that were working on all of that. And I learned a lot through that process. Was also responsible in collaboration with one of our other deans, who was the SACS liaison, of just educating the campus and the college about SACS. And then was also the chair of the QEP committee, and we sweated bullets for about 2.5, 3 years on developing our QEP. And that it didn't have any recommendations, and the college came out really good. So I've just got some firsthand experience with SACS, not by far, not an expert, but enough experience to really know what I'm talking about. So with that, what we're going to try to accomplish today is to talk about what SACS is and what's its authority and purpose, what our responsibilities are related to accreditation, what are some of the myths that are out there about SACS and debunk some of those, and then identify some resources that are available to you after we leave here today if you want to do some additional research with that, and then address some of the local questions that we've got. SACS is one of several regional accrediting bodies. We're here in the red. Of the northwestern, western, north central, and middle states in New England, Southern is considered to be the most rigid, most stringent. It's got the reputation for being the most, I don't know what rigid, can't think of another word, in accreditation requirements. The states that it covers are here. So Texas, 11 states, Louisiana, you can see all up in there, the area that SACS covers. And it's interesting, there's that big gap, there's no, Oklahoma, Georgia right there, it's just, Oklahoma and Arkansas are not there, but right next door to us. SACSOC, we say SACS, but when we write it in an acronym, it's Commission on Colleges. The technical way to write it is SACSOC, because they also accredit schools, K-12 schools as well, and universities. Universities and community colleges fall under the Commission on Colleges. It's a private, nonprofit, voluntary organization. Voluntary, if you want federal financial aid, you have to volunteer to participate. So voluntary is a little misleading. And then it was founded in 1895 in Georgia, and that's where headquarters still are located today. There are dues that we pay to be a member of SACS, and it's just based on that formula that's up there. So really, the bigger you are, the more you pay. But every institution pays to be a member of SACS. There are 6 core values. When you get familiar with the compliance, credentialing and all, that any document, you'll see these 6 core values really emphasized throughout. And the one thing about the first one, integrity, I've heard Belle Whelan speak about this multiple times. She's the president of SACS. And there really is an intention that you approach everything with SACS with honesty, and if it's not good news, tell us it's not good news. If you're not in compliance, tell us you're not in compliance. She has given examples of institutions that have submitted their compliance report but failed to double check their search and replace in every location and left the name of another institution in their compliance report. That violates the principle of integrity, and their accreditation was pulled because of that. So that's an extreme example. Can't imagine ever doing anything like that. And I can't say that we all don't go to each other's compliance reports and say, what did they say? How did they say it? But still with that intent of having integrity in all we do. Continuous quality improvement, that's going to connect to institutional effectiveness. It's a peer review process. People that come in and evaluate schools, whether it's an offsite or an onsite or substantive change, are people just like us. They're not, while SACS has paid staff, it's people just like us that are reviewing, so it really is a peer process. I've not been on a site review. I've been as an observer on a site review in South Carolina, and was in preparation for our accreditation visit at NCTC. So I didn't get to vote or do anything, but I was able to go through the process. And it was a little alarming, frankly, that when we got the compliance report, and then there was a follow-up, multiple phone call, conference calls, that really whether an institution was in compliance or not really boiled down to one person. Kathy, did you read that section? Yeah, I did. Are they in compliance? Looks good to me. Okay, let's move on. And that was a little alarming, that it could really come down to one person whose opinion was that we were or were not in compliance. So sometimes that works for you, sometimes that works against you. But accountability, student learning, and transparency, they're the 6 values. They have a structure where every CEO of every member institution is part of the delegate assembly. But then from that, they elect a 77-member board and then a 13-member executive council. So when we talk about the SACS board, that's who we're talking about. Now, there are other committees that form under that, a compliance committee. But when an action is taken, such as Lone Star, you're on monitoring, or Lone Star, we're going to consider what your future is, that's being considered by the board, which is made up of CEOs of institutions. They're some powerful people. So that's significant to know. Belle Whelan, I've already mentioned, as president. She's been with about 10 years, I guess, with SACS. Stephen Shealy there's several vice presidents, but Stephen Shealy is our liaison. So anytime we call SACS, and I've not called SACS since I've been here, that comes out of Carrie's office. That's who we're calling, is Shealy. So he's the one that's giving advice on credentials. He's the one that's telling us what we need to do to fix IE. He's our go-to person at SACS. Carrie Rogers, Vice Chancellor, is technically the SACS liaison for this system. Each system has one. So it's really not appropriate for me to pick up the phone and call. I guess I could, but really I need to go through Carrie, who would place the phone call to Sheila. Deborah Rockefeller is responsible then for the mechanical side of it, getting the compliance report, substantive change done, that kind of thing. Authorized by the Department of Education, and as I said a while ago, it's voluntary, but the U.S. Secretary of Education recognizes accreditation as our eligibility to participate in programs authorized under Title IV. Translation, if you want federal financial aid, you're going to be accredited. And so accreditation carries that weight and that burden, because not many schools could operate without the benefit of financial aid, or could we attract students if we don't have that accreditation standard. So here's the mission: enhance educational quality throughout the region and the improvement of the effectiveness of institutions by ensuring they meet standards established by the higher ed community that addresses the needs of society and students. If you think institutional effectiveness is just a pain and it's going to go away someday, just read the mission statement. It is so ingrained in what SACS is all about that it's not ever going to go away. It's in their mission statement. It's our effectiveness as an institution. It's what we're trying to improve. Accreditation signifies that we have a mission that's appropriate to higher ed, that we have the resources, programs, services sufficient to meet that mission, and that we have clearly stated educational objectives. Sounds like an IE process again to me. What are your learning outcomes? What are your goals and objectives for your programs and services that you have? Again, my point being that it is just so ingrained and embedded in the culture. So our responsibilities as a college is to comply with, first, the principle of integrity, and then the core requirements and comprehensive standards and federal requirements. And I'll differentiate those here in just a second. Enhance the quality of our educational programs, focus on learning, and again, ensure that culture of integrity in everything that we do. So core requirements. There's a fewer number of core requirements, but these are the ones that if you mess these up, you don't comply with the core requirements from the beginning, they could just take your accreditation right then without much notice or opportunity to fix it. Doesn't happen very often. They're broad-based enough and stated broadly enough that there's some room in there. There's also a comprehensive standard that attaches to each one of those, so it's hard not to do this. It's just, frankly, you would just have to completely ignore a piece of it. The 12 that are included there are related to governance and authority, and one says you have a CEO that has the background and administration has an expertise. I think even Cindy Gilliam's background got questioned in the initial SACS review because she didn't have a master's degree or something. That's what they were referring to here. But our structure, our mission, institutional effectiveness is stated in a core requirement. And so that's where it got a little dicey for Lone Star, is not having met that real well. It was touching on that core requirement. Program length and program content, that's pretty standard as far as just making sure that the program content's appropriate to the degree. It's pretty straightforward. Faculty here, it just says you have to have enough faculty to cover what you do. It doesn't tell us how many faculty that is. We'll get to some of that in the midst. That you have the financial resources and that you have the QEP. The comprehensive standards are the ones that are more specific. These are where most of the recommendations come from, or in the comprehensive standards. These are all spelled out and there's on your resource page, there's the principles of accreditation, there's a link. It's a pretty long PDF, but when you have a chance, you can go back and see. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these. We'd be here all day and still not get done. But you can see, based on these categories, there's 14 different categories of standards that we have to meet. that may not be a handout, it may be the last slide, one of the last slides on your PowerPoint handout, now that I think about it. So the thing that's a little deceiving about listing these this way is there may be 14 categories. There's 2 big ones on institutional effectiveness, but there's like 4 subpoints under each one. So you can't just count, this is all we have to be in compliance with. These are just the categories of compliance. There's many, many more. How many worked with SACS about 10 years ago before these comprehensive standards came out? You remember the old arrangement? Anybody? Anyone? Anyone? Remember Bueller? Bueller? Anyone? There were I can't remember the exact number now, but before we went to core requirements and comprehensive standards, it was just a long list of must statements. The institution must, the institution shall, the institution must, and there were like 485 of them, and it was an exorbitant amount. And the response to that basically was, we do, we do, we do, we do. It was more of just kind of a checklist. These are a lot broader, and the expectation and what's explicit through all of this is, number one, that you'll identify whether you're in compliance or not. You'll build a narrative to support that either way, but don't just tell us, show us. So anything that's written in a compliance report has to be backed up with documentation. So if you say there's a committee that's addressing institutional effectiveness, show me the minutes, show me the agenda, show me the handouts. And so there's a lot of supporting documentation that has to go behind every single one of these, and that's really the hard part. It's easy to write up the narrative, but then to have thought over the past several years, do I have minutes for that? How do I demonstrate that? So it's real important as we go through our just daily operations to keep in mind what artifacts are we creating just on a daily basis that might need to be used to support accreditation in the future. Example, so thinking about this yesterday, because I was so prepared and I was just getting this done yesterday, an evaluation form. So there's an evaluation form back there. It's important for me in my role to be able to document this process of professional development, and then in institutional effectiveness to have that assessment piece tied to it, so that I don't have to go retroactively, what y'all think about that? But always thinking forward, I need to do this evaluation now, I need to have this documentation now. So as you go through things that you do in your areas, think about what could be an artifact to support institutional effectiveness and accreditation in the future. What would happen is, as long as that one person who's responsible for reading that compliance standard saw that there was supporting documentation, I guarantee you they didn't open every single one of those documents. Because sometimes in a compliance report, you write your narrative, it's 2 pages long, but you could have 3 pages of supporting documentation. Well, they're going to random sample that, and if they're satisfied that, yeah, this looks relevant, that's all they're going to look at. But if they open one, or if there's not any there, or they open one and like, that doesn't make any sense, then they're going to dig deeper. And so that's just how the process works. So we've got 14 categories of the comprehensive standards, and then the federal requirements are required by U.S. Department of Education. Many of them are just repeats of what was in the comprehensive standards. So we just had to add a little bit more information. The one that's different is this item on student complaints. And what we had to provide, and what I'm sure Lone Star did too, is a real live example of how student complaints were handled. And what they're looking for is, did you follow your own policy? And that meant meeting minutes with the student, letters, PDFs of letters, all the way up if the student went to the board minutes of where that complaint was addressed. And so that was an interesting one. The deans have heard me say over and over, we've got to document this. We've got to document student complaints. Now, we're not having to write a compliance report. Chances are we have us having to provide that to SACS at any time. It's 10 years from now, but we still have a responsibility to document this just under the Department of Education guidelines as well. Okay, so I've talked about the process, so what's the process? A little bit of this is after the fact, since Lone Star just went through. What I want to say about this, I started to say it a while ago. When before we went to comprehensive standards, we had the 485,000 must statements, whatever it was. That changed about 10 years ago. In our reaffirmation cycles every 10 years. Lone Star, NCTC, those of us that were in this time frame didn't have the excuse of, oh, the standards changed. We didn't know exactly how to respond. Because these standards have been in place almost 10 years. So the schools early on that got under these new standards, they probably did get cited a little bit more because it was new to people. Institutional effectiveness was brand new. Now it's not so new anymore because we've been in this process for 10 years. So this is not new anymore. So what happens in year one is that the last Monday in January, a leadership team travels to Atlanta and goes to SACS headquarters and meets their liaison and just sets the date for their visit and just gets some instructions and some guidelines on what's going to happen. Then we have to submit an institutional summary form at that time, and that's just your name and enrollment, number of faculty, that kind of thing. Very simple. By March in year two, so let's say that happened in January of 2011, March 15, 2012, year two, your compliance report is due. But if you didn't start writing that compliance report before that first Monday in January, you're in trouble because it's just so massive and it just takes so much time to get that done. But so many institutions fall into that. They don't even start thinking about it until they get to that leadership team orientation. Leadership team orientation is usually the president, vice president, your SACS liaison, and faculty rep. Pretty typical makeup. So your compliance report is due, you update your institutional summary, and then the second week in May, an off-site review is conducted. That's what I was referring to a while ago, that on a conference call, someone will say, did you read section 2.8? Yeah, it looks good to me, and you're done. That off-site review is just what it says. It's an off-site analysis. There's a committee that looks at it. If they have findings from the off-site, then you have the opportunity to write a focus report, which is this right here. And that's due 6 weeks prior to your on-site. So they'll look at the off-site, looks like Lone Star NCTC is not compliant in 3.3.1, 2.7, 4.6, and they'll just give us a long list. And they'll give us an initial report. What you want to do is address all of those issues in the focus report. If an issue is satisfied in the focus report, they won't and can't ask you about it at the on-site review. But if it's not fully addressed in the focus report and they still have questions, you guarantee that's what they're going to ask about. So they show up, showing up when they show up what they're interested in. Your QEP is also due at this time. Then you have your on-site review. 5 months after the on-site, you give your response. 3rd week in June, review by the board. So this past June, the board at SACS reviewed Lone Star's response to the on-site review. On-site review is a different committee from the off-site. It's a completely different set of people. But what they've got is the report from the off-site, the focus report. They've read your compliance report, your focus report, your QEP. But they're showing up prepared, ready to go. There's no time spent, well, let me get familiar with your compliance report. They've done all of that already. So 3rd week in June this summer, the board looked at our response. Last summer, the time gets crazy. Last summer, they looked at it and said, no, Lone Star, you missed it. You haven't fully satisfied, even after the off-site review, the focus report, the on-site review, still missed it in faculty credentials, institutional effectiveness, and your QEP. So that's why we went on monitoring. because we didn't adequately satisfy them in our response after the site visit. Now, with IE, that was, Lone Star just started too late. We just waited too late, and we're trying to cram a whole bunch of stuff in a complex system, and so we're still trying to dig out of that time frame hole. The QEP, they needed to rework the learning outcomes on that, and then the credentials required us, because of the monitoring status, to submit a full faculty roster for last fall and last spring. And monitoring just is that, they're just monitoring. So they reviewed our response again. The last monitoring report was due like in April. They looked at it again in June, and they said we're still on monitoring. We're not off. The things that have kept us on monitoring are institutional effectiveness. We still have not completed the cycles, completed the loops to the degree that they're satisfied. QEP is no longer being monitored. And with faculty credentials, the only thing that's being monitored are faculty with government degrees, and specifically Masters of Public Administration. The SACSOC said that we had to look at, if someone had an MPA, Masters of Public Administration, what were the course content of the courses they took? Were they business focused, or were they government political science focused? So now we have to submit a faculty roster for just government faculty for fall and spring. We've been working with Annie and Jill on that. Tomball's in pretty good shape. We had one adjunct. I'm convinced he's credentialed. We're kind of in an appeal process right now on him. The thing about SACS, and I've referred to it a couple of times, I don't know where to stick this in, so I'll just stick it in here. SACS won't tell you what to do. They won't say your institutional effectiveness process should look like this, this, and this. And they won't tell you this is what your student complaint process should be. And they won't tell you, even though they have guidelines on credentials, exactly what they're supposed to be. And I've sat in rooms at SACS conventions with 2,000 people in the room, and the poor soul raises his hand and stands up and says, why don't you just tell us what you want? And the response is, you don't want us to do that. You don't want us to dictate what that looks like, because what's right for Lone Star may not work at Ranger College, may not work at Valencia in Florida. So what SACS is looking for in the compliance report is, do you do what you say you do? Do you follow your policies? A great example is when they'll say, number of faculty sufficient to deliver the mission of the institution. Well, what does that mean? There is not a number out there, and the answer is institutions set it and strive for that. That's your call. So that's what makes the compliance report a little bit difficult, is it truly is justifying your own policy decisions. Are you following your own policies? Are you doing what you say you do? And when you're not in compliance, what you're not in compliance with is typically your own policy. So that's where it gets a little bit challenging. 10 years ago, when this process changed, they added this 5th year interim report. I've not worked on one of those before. This will be brand new to me. But it's a mini self-study. It covers some, but not all of the compliance standards that we just looked at. And it's the report on your QEP. Did it do what you said it was going to do? What are the learning outcomes? What is in your assessments? How did it go? What's hard about this is it's easy to say, well, SACS isn't going to be here for 10 more years. Yeah, no, not really, because we got to start thinking about this 5th year interim report now, and then the QEP interim report, and then thinking about that timeline I just showed you. It's going to be time to start thinking about the next QEP and the next round. It's just really never, it's more of an ebb and flow, but we never get to step away from it. Okay, so as I said, possible outcomes, so there could be reaffirmation without recommendations. That rarely, it comes down somewhat to who reads the documents, who's on that team. And it was fine But I just expected so much more because they walked away without any recommendations. And it wasn't all bad. It was not bad, but it just wasn't all bad either. Reaffirmation with recommendations is the most common outcome. And recommendations aren't bad. You just respond, satisfy them, and move forward. If you don't satisfy them, you wind up where we are now, reaffirmation with monitoring. Then after that, it's warning, probation, and removal of membership. So what's going to happen where we are right now? Okay, sub-change. So that's compliance. That's the, follow the rules, dot your I's, cross your T's, do what you say you're going to do in the process. There's a whole other SACS process, I don't know if any of you have been involved in here, that's substantive change. And that's always happening, always going on. We're always dealing with sub-change, sub-C is what we call it. And really, it's just the level of change, the significance of the change, pointer, the lower the significance of the change, the less you have to do for approval and notification. So if it's a low-level change, we're just adding a certificate. It fits in kind of like what we're already doing. It's just a letter. But we're communicating with SACS all the time, just outside the reaffirmation process. If it's a significant change, Jakarta, then it requires a site visit. So in February, I saw the letter last week. SACS did approve Lone Star to go ahead with classes in Jakarta, but the site visit will occur in February. And so they're going. They're going to go make sure that we're in compliance with all the requirements that are required when you do a substantive change. One of the middle levels, and I do have a handout on this, I'm going to steal yours just a second, because sub-change is very complex. There's a handout here that describes all the various different types of changes that can occur and then what actions are needed to follow that. If it's, once an institution, kind of a mid-level change, but once an institution has 3 off-site locations, then you just have to do a modified prospectus, and it becomes much easier. But since Jakarta is such a big change, they've got to go see that and visit over there. One of the, I think I've got it in the slide. I'll come back to it if I don't have it here. There's 3 procedures. We're not going to really talk about 3. 1 and 2. Procedure 1, if it just requires notification and approval prior or just notification. The things that require approval, and this is here, this initiated offsite here, hits us in dual credit. Because if we say Concordia Lutheran, we're offering these 15 classes, we've just initiated an offsite where at least 50% of the credits are earned at an offsite location. So we have to track, and when a high school calls and says, can we offer this dual credit class? And it's new, just a minute, if it's above 49% of the total degree, then we have to go through a whole sub-change and have approval for that. So it's not as simple just to, and schools don't get that, but it's not as simple just to add it. Yeah, we can do that class. We have to track this very, very closely, and this is where Deborah becomes very helpful for us. Initiating a branch campus is what Jakarta would be, and why approval is needed. Let's see. Distance education, again, the 50% mark. So if you've got a program that you're looking at wanting to start offering more online classes, and you're going to go across that 50% threshold, there's some additional sub-change things we have to do. Expanding the current degree program, so like degree level, so if all of a sudden we wanted to offer a bachelor's degree, well then we'd have to go through sub-change. The rest of these are less common. If we relocated, if we collaborated with someone not accredited or not authorized under Department of Education. Procedure 2, for site-based classroom instruction, so where the classroom is, teachers in the classroom, we still have to report on dual credit if it's less than 25%, between 25 and 50%. And so that's a very common thing. And so we just send a letter, no big deal. But again, once it crosses that 50% threshold, then we're in another ballgame. And then if we just happen to move the sign to a different area. All of this, 25%, 50% also applies to distance ed. So again, if you've got a program, we need to add more online courses, that's part of your UEP, and we're gonna grow enrollment by changing these courses to online. Again, we have to watch the percentage of the program offered online. It's no big deal, we just have to be sure and notify SACS. Because they do, we did it at NCTC, we did something, I can't remember now exactly, I think it was our Grand campus, and we didn't tell them, and we got our hands slapped. So we learned about sub-C real quick. They find out, I mean, they know. And so it's just something that an administrative task we have to follow. Okay, so let's get to some of the myths and realities. This is not mine, I stole it, but I did cite it, so it's really not plagiarism, right, Kathy? Okay, so I did create the slides, his were ugly. But peer review teams, I've already said about this, are SACS employees who go from institution to institution. That's not true. I've already talked about that. It's made up of people just like us sitting in this room who volunteer to do that. There's no pay involved at all for doing that. One thing that's interesting, though, is from a conflict of interest perspective, if the college like us is in Texas, no one on our site team, off-site or on-site, will be from Texas. I went to South Carolina, no one on that team was from South Carolina. So they really do take that into consideration. Faculty have no direct stake in the accreditation process. True or false? Yeah, false. There are several standards, especially 4.1, 4.10, 3.74, and then in Michael Johnson's own, it's hard to imagine a successful quality enhancement plan that doesn't have major faculty involvement. Another myth, sampling is not considered a viable means of assessment. There's been some discussion about that here. Can we sample? Please sample. Yes, we should sample. So that's very much supported and encouraged by SACS. Only positive outcomes should be reported by an institution on institutional effectiveness. Those of you that have been in a meeting with me at all on IE have heard me say, it's okay if you don't meet your outcome. It's okay if you said 75% is your target criteria and you hit 60. That's okay. That's fine. What SACS is more interested in is that you have a process. So don't fudge it and say, back to the principle of integrity, yeah, we did it, woohoo. Because you've got to provide that supporting documentation right behind it that proves it. So they would much rather you just say, yep, we didn't make it. Here's why, here's what we're going to do. And if we met all of our outcomes and requirements, what is there left to do to get better? So it's unreasonable that we wouldn't meet that we would meet every outcome. Every institution is failing institutional effectiveness, especially 2.5 and 3.3.1. That core requirement 2.5 is the one related to institutional effectiveness. It's not cited very often. So the breakdown, this is from, in his slides, the class of 2011, I think. Offsite, that's the offsite review where the offsite team read it and they marked it non-compliance 31% of the time. On-site then means once they showed up, then it drops to 6%. So what that probably means is they just didn't describe it correctly, they didn't have the right documentation, but it drops significantly by the time they do their focus report and this team comes on site. The CNR monitoring report, that's what we're doing now. Yeah, we are in an elite group. 5% of the time. Where it's mostly cited, and 3.3.1 is the most cited out of compliance standard across all SACS institutions. It's the #1 most cited issue. So, yeah, class of 2011-12. So at the off-site, Out of 157 institutions, 66% of them were deemed in the off-site review. What happens? They do their focus report, they provide additional documentation, they clean it up, and it drops to 43%, and at CNR monitoring level, it drops to 27%. So this is in the comprehensive standard. They're both addressing institutional effectiveness, but one's a core requirement. They can pull your accreditation immediately. This one is the one where you have a chance to make it right. You can see the difference between the 3.3.1.1 is all the student learning outcome stuff. The 1.2 and the 1.3 is administrative services, so your facilities, your budget, your HR, those things, and then it's academic and student support. So by far the biggest challenge is in the student learning outcomes. But isn't it true that student learning outcomes really don't need to identify learning outcomes? Student services don't need to identify learning outcomes because it's student services. What are they going to learn? No offense, I'm just trying to build it up a little bit. But truly, there's learning that occurs through student services, change in values or increased knowledge. And so we really need to get to the point where student services units are assessing learning outcomes. And frankly, I can't tell you if we're there yet. I think Juanita is pushing on that, Chrysanthal, Vice Chancellor at the student services side. But I don't know, Cornelius, if we're there.
We're definitely at our campus. We're definitely in the leadership team discussion, student success. We're definitely at our campus. If we're identifying those learning outcomes for each one of our areas as well as.
Good.
It is sinking in, you know what I mean, for those of us down in the ranks there. I mean, it's a new step, because
Sure.
we're so into providing the service. Wait, you want me to stop and get or evaluate it or look it out? I mean, we're just busy doing the next service, you know, so
It is a mind shift. It is a cultural shift to think it's not about doing more. It's about assessing what you're doing, and that's what we don't just naturally think of. You have to really stop and go, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be assessing this. But that's where the UEP comes in, because you're doing a whole lot of stuff that you don't have to put on that unit effectiveness plan. We don't have to report everything we're doing to SACS. That's the secret. You've got to keep the UEP content manageable. The problem we've got at Tomball now, it's unmanageable. I was going through Compliance Assist yesterday, line by line, and I stopped counting when I had 22 individual items that I'm either the sponsor or the task owner for. That's nuts. That's unmanageable. But we've all got that problem. So in the refining of this process, we have got to make this manageable. And that's all SACS is going to look at. If we satisfy them by these 3 examples on our UEP of how we're assessing what we do and how we're making improvements based on that assessment, done. So that's another shift I encourage you to really think about. You don't have to include every single thing. But on those things that you choose to put on your unit effectiveness plan, make darn sure that those are the ones you're assessing, because you have to provide that supporting documentation. The thing I'm not hearing talked about much, unless it came up in the Dean's Council the other day, is providing that supporting documentation for all of our UEP stuff. It's not being talked about. And there's a place in Compliance Assist, if you go in and look, that you click and it says supporting documentation. Guys, if you can find anything to put in there, that's going to be part of the secret, because all we're doing right now is saying, yeah, we do that. They did it. I saw the eye contact and the wink. Y'all are good. Everywhere you can put supporting documentation in, put it in. I think that could bite us pretty soon if we don't start thinking more in terms of uploading that supporting documentation. It's a pain, but we've just got to do that. We talked about student services. 3 myths. Part-time faculty don't have to have the same qualifications. Dual credit faculty don't have to have the same qualifications, nor do faculty at international sites. Who thinks that? I know, thank you, Steve. Golly, those are all obviously wrong. And yes, principals don't make any distinction, faculty or faculty, and all must meet the same credentials and requirements, regardless of whether it's face-to-face, online, dual credit. This one's my favorite. There's a magical number that determines the sufficient number of full-time faculty. Yeah, it would be nice. Yeah, 90% would be great, right? There is a requirement that every off-campus site, every distance learning program has full-time faculty teaching in the program. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that's all they teach? I mean, so there's a little bit of a, but I wish they'd give us, basically, we've said as an institution, 50-50 would be great. And I'm aggregating everything. Most, where we are is mostly 60%, 40% as a system. Adjunct full-time, 60% adjunct. But there are departments, Jill, we looked at it when we were doing budget, that have 75% adjunct and 25% part-time, full-time. And those are the target areas where we've really got to look and try to fix. Okay, this is the resource document I was thinking of a while ago. I thought it was separate. The actual principles of accreditation are at this link. Sub-change policy statements there in the 5th year report.